Go.
Hello, my name is Dr. James O. Webb with the University of Fairfax. I'm the dean here, and we have every 2 months we have these webinars. We're very fortunate this week or for this month to have a presenter, Dr. Claude L. Jenkins II, to be our host. As we get started, the one thing I'd like to ask everybody is if you have questions, please submit them on Twitter with the hashtag cybersecurity live, and then we'll get to those questions at the end of this presentation. The presentation, as I mentioned, is going to be presented by Dr. Jenkins, and it's on establishing a cyber defense information sharing network. Now, Dr. Jenkins is a retired United States Air Force, United States Army Chief Warrant Officer 4. He served 24 years with the Signal and Ordnance Corps. He has a proven technology leader and practitioner with the ability to lead within and across the Department of Defense and federal boundaries. He's a subject matter expert in the area of cybersecurity. So without any further ado, I now give you Dr. Jenkins.
Thank you very much, Dr. Webb. And good evening, good afternoon, good morning to all of our participants and international participants. Again, my name is Dr. Claude L. Jenkins II, and I am presenting to you this afternoon a webinar establishing a cyber defense information sharing framework. And without further ado, let's get into the presentation, please. Next slide. So Dr. Webb did a wonderful job in introducing myself and presenting to all of you my background and history. Again, 24 years retired United States Army. I had a plethora of opportunities during that particular time and even after I retired. I am a proud graduate of the University of Fairfax. I graduated in March of 2016. I currently work with the Communications and Electronics Command Software Engineering Center as a Science and Technology Manager and a Computer Science and Engineering Technical Lead. With that being said, I have the opportunity to be exposed to a lot of different learning portals, one being the Joint Knowledge Online Portal. And in doing so, I was able to come across this particular topic. And I thought that this would be a really good topic to share via webinar. It gives the perspective from an organization called the Multinational Experiment 7. And this is a pretty good segue to launch me into the next slide and present the webinar agenda for tonight. So next slide, please. Thank you. So the agenda for this evening's webinar include the following topics of focus. I will basically provide an overview of what the Multinational Experiment 7 or MNE7 organization is and the nations and organizations which make up an MNE7. I will also introduce the term global commons as it's used by MNE7 and the domain areas that make up the global commons. I will also provide a brief overview of the MNE7's concept and perspective of the information sharing framework, information sharing model, which focuses on federated access controls. And I will also talk about the various aspects of the information sharing model. I will also speak to the information management model, which focuses on the information to be shared. And I will conclude with talking about information sharing agreements, which focuses on how information is shared. Next slide, please. Thank you. So what is the Multinational Experiment 7 or MNE7? Well, MNE7 is a campaign consisting of several work strands, each dealing with different aspects of access to what is called the global commons. The global commons is considered the domains that actually make up the global commons, which is air domain, sea domain, space domain, and cyber domain. And as the name suggests, these particular domains are not controlled or governed by any one particular nation. Collaboration among the nations and organizations listed here depends on the ability to share sensitive information between and among trusted partners. This collaboration is made possible with the establishment of an information sharing framework, which describes sensitive information should be shared across organizations, enhancing the organization's cyber situational awareness, thereby improving the individual and collective decision-making processes of these entities. The information sharing framework therefore gives a strategic guidance on the policies, the procedures, and the mechanisms that any trusted partner will require in order to collaborate. Next slide, please. The term cybersecurity and cyberspace, used synonymously, is used effectively in business, law, and policy, and it has highly useful applications in that it provides a reference to the virtual, that is to say, other than the physical world, created by the internet and other electronic communications. Cyberspace is considered a global commons domain of great significance and of great interest, as all other domains depend increasingly upon it for their management and future. As one can imagine, the need to ensure access to the cyberspace is profound and pervasive. Every nation, every industry sector on the planet depends daily and directly, and in some cases indirectly, on having unhindered access to cyberspace. Cyberspace does not exist without the physical components which it is comprised of. These components consist of interdependent network of information technology infrastructures, the internet, the telecommunication networks, computer systems, and embedded processors and controllers. Next slide, please. The boundaryless nature of cybersecurity, the speed and scale of effects, and the relative ease with which one can remain anonymous compounds the complexity of the challenges facing the decision makers and organizations responsible for ensuring secure access to cyberspace. The two strategic threats, concerns in cyberspace, according to MNE's perspectives, are the deliberate and inadvertent disruption of cyberspace, denial of service, of course, and data exfiltration, the deliberate thefts, corruption, and inadvertent loss of sensitive data. Within the information sharing framework, cybersecurity is defined as a property of cyberspace that is has the ability to resist intentional and unintentional threats, and to respond and recover to these threats. Next slide, please. Current cybersecurity focuses on enabling detection and post-action reporting. MNE defines cyber situational awareness as a human perception of elements of cyberspace within the operational and business context, the comprehension of their meaning and the projection of their status in the near future. Cyber situational awareness exists to enable effective organizational and collaborative decision-making to support the protection of cyber infrastructures and cyber services that operate within cyberspace. Cyber situational awareness consists of 5 major activities, as we see illustrated here on this particular slide deck. The physical world status, of course, includes information of any events or developments that could impact access to cyberspace or be impacted by the incidents that take place within cyberspace. Prevention status, the health normality, or better said, what right looks like within an organization when it is cyber healthy. Cyber threats and vulnerability status, planning or planned changes. These are changes that are requested through channels that are in the form of engineering change proposals or change requests, etc. Those changes that are planned. And then, of course, incident management, which is the fifth activity, those unplanned, unexpected changes that impact the operability of a particular network or system. Next slide, please. Thank you. Information sharing is an important enabler of the decision-making process. The quality of decision-making depends largely on the quality of available information. Quality is more than just integrity, completeness, timeliness, and accuracy of the information, all of which degrades over time, obviously. Information needs to be in a form that is rapidly consumable internally as well as externally. This requires operational processes and information management processes to be synchronized. That's very important. MNE7's employed an information sharing model to understand and facilitate the sharing of information among different entities. This information sharing model is based on standards and focuses on security controls derived from policies, derived from procedures and mechanisms for federated trust, and a set of taxonomies for information interoperability. Next, we'll examine the various aspects of the information sharing model. The topics will include a look at the architectural view. We'll also just briefly talk about the structural view. We will go into a little in depth with information sharing agreements, information sharing processes. We'll talk about trustworthiness, federation, and AAA authentication, authorization, and access. And of course, access. And then of course, we'll speak about taxonomy. Next slide, please. Okay, for the information sharing model architectural view, we start with the architectural view of an information sharing model. In this illustration, entity A shares information with entity B, conducting business within and across the government and military and industry. So this is just a generic model on how entities within MNE7 shares information. Each entity itself has 5 components. Component 1, process. This is the tier where decisions are made. Tier 2, information. Information, of course, supports decision making. Tier 3, application. This is the tier where information is aggregated and collected to be able to provide decision makers with the data necessary to make informed decisions. Tier 4, data, defined as interoperable and has quality criteria, which is very important. And finally, 5, infrastructure, which provides secure hosting and communication for the data that's housed. Now, the red line that you see illustrated here indicates the minimum requirements for collaboration between 2 entities, which is data and infrastructure. Without these 2 entities, one would say that these 2 entities are considered to be isolated and not collaborative between one another. By sharing cybersecurity information and coordinating their actions, cyber defense organizations are better prepared to mitigate threats and disruptions within cyberspace. This requires the establishment of building a trust relationship based on authentication, authorization, and accountability. I said access before, I misspoke, I apologize. So the AAA actually stands for authentication, authorization, and accountability. Next slide. Today's structure of cyber defense organization has arisen from what we call a bottom-up, reactive, evolutionary approach that shares threats and vulnerability information either pre or post-incident. After the fact, and now MNE7, their perspective is to basically take a look at that particular model and incorporate a top-down approach to interconnect and align existing organizations, like, for instance, the computer emergency response teams, or we call them CERTs, or the warning advice and reporting points, or WARPs, and establish a core structure for cybersecurity organizations to enable collaboration, protection, detection, prioritization, and responses that are made responsible by sharing this information, leading to appropriate cyber situational awareness. Likewise, today's cyber organizations don't monitor the same threats that they have in the past, obviously, because of advanced persistent threats, the advanced methods that the culprits are actually using to infiltrate particular networks, thereby crippling, in some cases, corporations and even countries in some cases. Next slide, please. Okay. MNE7 employed a functional approach to information sharing using what's called a hub and node concept. I'll just briefly discuss what the hub and node concept is, and we will continue to proceed. So a node is the focus for a trusted community of interest of a cyber organization, like I had mentioned before, the CERTs, the WARPs, and one other organization I did not mention, which is the Computer Information and Resource Centers, or CERTs, is what we call them. Nodes use standard-based information sharing processes tailored to be implemented through a common set of, again, policies, procedures, and mechanisms. There has to be internationally recognized and approved and agreed upon standards in order for this particular model to work. A node's function and functional scope include the following. Nodes support for cyber defense intelligence, which basically shares threats, vulnerabilities, and analysis information. Cyber defense operations basically focus on the development of internal and external monitoring and access control, management processes and procedures, as well as monitoring and maintaining cybersecurity incident management processes and procedures. Nodes can range from being a small geographically located and focused entity all the way to being as large and multifunctional as a center, basically maintaining and managing national and international cybersecurity efforts. A hub, on the other hand, operates to support nodes and enables top-level decision-making, usually at the national and or international level. Next slide, please. Thank you. The relationship between hubs and nodes and tactical organizations are not hierarchical, as we actually see in this particular slide. Instead, they are interconnected based on business needs and compliance with federated policies. Normally, one hub would exist for a nation or a region of smaller nations, or an international organization such as NATO or the European Union. There may be two hubs for a global industry sector, such as banking, healthcare, or aerospace, etc., or for a technology community such as Microsoft, Linux, Apple, etc. Next slide, please. Thank you. Having learned about hubs and nodes, it's time for us now to focus our efforts to talking a little bit about information sharing agreements. So an information sharing agreement is an agreement made between two or more collaborating organizations, which describes verification and compliance methodologies. Information sharing agreements define at minimum the scope and type of information to be shared, obviously, the type of information to be shared, roles and responsibilities of all entities and players involved, access controls, taxonomies and data labels, legal and or policy timelines, enforcement procedures, And of course, last but definitely not least, compliancy. In practice, organizations cannot support multiple information sharing agreements. Instead, organizations subscribe to one ISA for each community of interest in which it has to participate within. Each community's ISA will have some commonality as well as some differences in their authorization and accountability models. However, the communities should have a single authorization model based on federation at an agreed upon level of assurance and multiple authentication models, which are or should not be too difficult, too costly, and risk averse. Lastly, hub and nodes would leverage information sharing methods of push and pull, okay, with federated access across the particular communication lines that they actually communicate with using the AAA model. Some of the ways that two entities or two or more entities actually communicate with one another and share information with one another are, of course, by secure email, by the use of dashboards, secure databases, collaborative tools, there are many, and business social networking. Next slide, please. Thank you. As businesses and operations become more collaborative and international, there are increasingly legal, regulatory, and commercial requirements for accountability and information protection in regulated industries as well as organizations. Such information protection requires access controls, without a doubt, which requires identity, authorization, authentication, as well as accountability. These are the basis for trust among government, military, and industry entities. Trust across multiple organizations requires federation, where all federated members agree to abide by a set of policies and procedures, as well as mechanisms defined in a federation common policy. And this is what I was talking about earlier, a few slides back. All organizations have to be considered trustworthy to trust each other within the community. Otherwise, this particular model would not work. There are internal implications, and there are third-party trusted agencies to ensure that federated trust is, for the most part, abide by based off of policy, based off of procedures, based off of mechanisms, etc. Organizations also need a common language to understand each other. This is where taxonomies come into play. Federations require collaborative governance and agreed upon common policy in order for this particular model to be successful. Next slide, please. Once the information sharing process is created and trustworthiness, federation, and AAA are established, information sharing entities will need to establish a common taxonomy. Taxonomies, as defined by Multinational Experimentation 7, they define taxonomies as a set of agreed upon definitions for data and rules for the use of information that is going to be shared among entities. It is used for information preparation, and taxonomies should be, and these are some of the basic rules, should be easily understood, should have a specific and definite use, it should be media independent, it should have a logical hierarchy to it as well. It should conform to published taxonomy standards, and there are some standards that exist within the Department of Homeland Security. The Department of Defense have taxonomy standards as well that are shared throughout coalition partners. Taxonomies should not be redundant to other defined metadata to cause any confusion, and should not be nested more than 5 levels. And I provided an illustration as to what a taxonomy guide should look like within the slide deck. Next slide, please. Now, speaking about the information, we're getting a little deep about the context of the information. the traffic light protocol is used. So the traffic light protocol, or TLP, is one example of how to classify and release information within a federated information sharing community. Using the TLP, the originator of the information, the person who aggregates this information to be shared, can label the information with one of four colors to indicate what further dissemination, if any, can be undertaken by the recipient. TLPs also can be used in conjunction with information classification models, and there are many out there, such as a priority information requirement to relate kinds of information to reliability and access control. Next slide. Establishing an effective cyber information sharing framework requires first establishing a way to manage the information being shared. What is needed is an information management model that encompasses information management, the generation and maintenance of the cyber situational awareness, information preparation, and the types of shared information. Information sharing is an important enabler of the decision-making process, and for good reason. The quality of decision-making depends largely on the quality of available information. Quality is more than just integrity, completeness, timeliness, and accuracy of the information. Information needs to be in a form that is rapidly consumable, both, again, like I mentioned before, internally and externally. This requires operations, processes, and information management processes to be synchronized as soon and as quickly as possible. Next slide, please. Not with everything, just like systems and processes, etc. Information itself has a life cycle. So information, the information life cycle has at least 4 states. This is just generally how information is created here. So we start with creation of information. And of course, once the rudimentary information is aggregated and created from the data points, it is updated to stay relevant. It's archived for later use. And of course, when it has no further use, it's either deleted and or purged. Next slide, please. So some of the key actions of information management include, again, the type of information decides what type of information are important to support each major business process. And this basically points back to the TLP slide that we spoke about a few slides ago, the color coding in regard to who and how this particular information is shared. Of course, a taxonomy, a set of established rules and commonalities to ensure that all are aware of how the information is going to be shared and what type of information will be shared. The source and availability of the information, we're basically talking about the authoritative data source of this information once aggregated, the roles and responsibilities of those that are responsible for disseminating, creating, and sharing this information, and of course, the classification of the information itself. Next slide, please. The ability to generate cyber situational awareness depends on all participating organizations managing their internal and shared cyberspace risk in compliance with agreed common policy. This requires 2 concurrent activities: risk assessment and risk mitigation. Cyber situational awareness is generated and maintained from pooling and sharing information regarding the physical world status information, prevention status information based on the security controls that are in place to ensure the protection of that particular information through CIA, confidentiality, availability, and integrity. Information regarding threats and vulnerabilities, which is the sensitive data that basically spells the health and the normality of a particular system or a group of systems, or an organization or a nation. Plan changes, and of course, incident management. Next slide, please. Okay, so before a decision can be made on releasing information, the information itself must be prepared. This is accomplished through, of course, data collection and analysis, formatting and anonymization, information classification, like I mentioned several slides ago, and information publication and distribution. This points back to the TLP protocol that we saw earlier. Next slide, please. Shared cyber situational awareness information needs to meet a number of quality criteria, all of which include accuracy, richness, timeliness, and validation. Now, validation is important. So for validation, a scheme to be measured, or a scheme to measure the accuracy and the richness of the information, is also required. There's two ways to actually acquire the validation of information. The first is to have the information validated by a subject matter expert. This information has to be reviewed by the appropriate subject matter expert. And once it has been viewed by the appropriate subject matter expert, this information can be judged to be called creditable. And there's a pre-validation process as well, where this information has not yet been viewed by an appropriate subject matter expert, but still judged to be creditable based off of where the information has been aggregated, based on the data points it was pulled, or that was pulled to aggregate the data. It just has not been verified by a subject matter expert, and probably will not be disseminated until such time a subject matter expert has viewed that data or that information, send it to the appropriate decision makers, and to make informed decisions to ensure the protection of any organization, entity, nation, may it be national or international. So with that being said, ladies and gentlemen, this concludes my webinar. And at this particular point, I will turn back over the microphone to Dr. Webb, and I will make myself available for any questions, comments, or concerns.
Okay, Dr. Jenkins, we thank you so much for taking the time to present to us at this time. Now I'm going to ask Ms. Hardy, do we have any question that came in through our Twitter feed?
Yes, we do. The first question is, can the concept of the information sharing framework be incorporated within small organizations?
Absolutely, absolutely. Just like the name suggests, information sharing framework, though this is a framework that's used at the multi-international level, a lot of the concepts can actually be incorporated at the lowest organizational level as well, just tailored uniquely to an organization's unique business operations. Good question.
Okay, awesome. And looks like we have another question. They're asking, can you explain a bit more on how the information sharing model and the information sharing agreements work in general?
Yes, I can. The way that the information sharing model and the information sharing agreements work is basically based off of transitive trusts between organizations, agreed upon taxonomies, and coalition agreements. So without trust, obviously, there's not going to be any collaboration or sharing of information. That's where the third party evaluator will actually take a look and ensure that all entities that are within the MNE environment are all trustworthy or have federated trust amongst one another, so that when information is shared, then there are no issues. And this is, again, where the traffic light protocol policies and procedures come into play. This is where information sharing agreements are agreed upon This is where policies and procedures are agreed upon. And so everyone within that conglomerate understands that they can share information freely, because cyber situational awareness is what this is all about.
Okay, thank you. That's awesome. I'm checking to see if there's any more questions. Again, you can submit your questions to Twitter at #cybersecuritylive. Okay, that seems to be all of our questions, but if you have any other questions for Dr. Jenkins, you can still submit to #cybersecuritylive after the webinar is completed, or you can send him an email to the contact information you see on his screen. Dr. Webb?
Well, again, we appreciate everybody's attendance today. Again, we will be having these webinars. We have these every 2 months. So our next one is in September, and we look forward. We already have a fantastic speaker lined up for you for that one as well. So again, we appreciate your participation in this webinar. Thank you.